If I was an investor, I would be asking, has this development been designed with an operating philosophy or strategy in mind? What is it about this building that will make people pay a premium to live in there and want to stay for the long term?
Hello to all of our listeners and welcome to the Investment Insights podcast with Select Property. I'm Amber Furr and I'm really excited to be here today with our own Giles Beswick, Senior Director at Select Property since Select Property was founded in 2004. So welcome, Giles.
Nice to be here as always. Look forward to seeing where the conversation will lead today.
Definitely. So in the time then that you've been working with Select, so since 2004, you must have seen so much change in the residential property market. What would you say have been the key drivers that have shaped the residential market as we know it today?
Well, we could spend a long time talking about the last 20 years or so. I'd say that throughout that period, there's been a lot of change. And actually, when you look back, you can link a lot of those changes together. Even when we look back at things that we saw happening 10, 15, 20 years ago, you can see a trace of that now in what's happening. I actually think now is probably the most exciting period within the whole of the life of the business to be doing what we're doing. I think two key changes stand out for me most recently. One is a sort of a change in the demographic or the demand from the kind of people who are renting properties in city centres like Manchester. We're talking predominantly about young people. And we've talked a lot about how, for that generation, renting is now a first choice.
Yeah.
So whereas perhaps previously people who rented their property did so because that was the only way for them to afford to live where they wanted to live, now I think people are making that as a positive choice. And I think choosing changes everything in that sense, because what that means is residential accommodation has become much more of a resident-led proposition and service. So I think we've seen a bit of a sort of a shift in the power dynamic, whereas it used to be landlords who had all of the power. Now I think it's much more of a demand-driven sector, which is a good thing, because with that shift comes a much more rapid evolution of what developers are doing, because they're having to, because it's a much more competitive space. And we know that young people in particular as consumers are very discerning and they have quite high expectations. And in particular, in the kind of locations where our buildings are, which are leading locations, they're paying a lot for their accommodation. So you have to offer something that's compelling to make sure that they feel like they're getting value for money. So that's been one big change, I think. And then something that's linked to that is that has forced developers and operators and managers to think about residential accommodation as much more of a consumer product and service. So we're starting to see a lot more branded residential operational styles out there now. And you can see elements of what's happening in residential accommodation that have come from other sectors like the hotel sector. People are familiar with staying in a Four Seasons hotel will mean certain things compared to staying in a more of a budget or economy hotel. And also we saw that a little bit with student accommodation as well, which I always think of as being sort of almost like a glimpse into the future of branded, purpose-built, professionally managed accommodation. So I think those two things which link together have been one of the biggest shifts.
Absolutely. And when you say branded residences, it's quite easy for people to just kind of assume it might just be a name or a logo. But as you say, it's a promise, isn't it? Every brand has a promise of their brand standards and what you can expect to either be an investor investing in that brand, or in this case, a resident living in that brand building. So what does that look like, a branded residence? What value does that bring to the resident and then in turn the investor?
It's a really good question. I've thought a lot about that, and it's quite an unusual concept to get your head around, isn't it? Maybe 5 or 10 years ago, people would have found it difficult to think about accommodation as something that you could brand in that way. But when you think about what actually is a brand, it's what makes a brand stand out is certain attributes or a personality that convey a certain association with it. And there's no reason why that can't apply to your accommodation in the same way that it applies to the clothes that you wear or the car that you choose or lots of other things that we've got accustomed to being branded. And I was having this conversation with Beth actually earlier in the week, our colleague Beth, who said for her age group now, quite often when people ask you where you live, they don't tell you the street or the name, they tell you the name of the building. They say, I live in an Affinity Living building.
Yeah.
Because people choose to buy brands and associate themselves with brands because not only because of the quality of the product and the service, which is an important part of it, but also because that choice says something about you. And it's interesting that that's starting to happen in accommodation as well. That people will describe where they live by naming the building or the operator of the building in a way that it communicate something about their lifestyle choices, their preferences. And essentially, I think that's what elevates accommodation into the status of something that you can attach a brand to. And it's really interesting then how that starts to play out. And in answer to your question about what that means for investors, I think from an investor's point of view, if you see the property that you're buying into or development that you're buying into as buying into the power of that brand that's attached to it, I think brands deal in the currency of dependability, don't they? So for exactly the same reason that people will spend more for a pair of trainers because they identify with the brand, I think people are similarly starting to spend more for the gym that they will use because they identify with something about the way that gym is operated. They identify with the community of other people that use it. It brings something to their life and their lifestyle that another one that might be more affordable doesn't. So from an investor's point of view, I think in a way it makes it harder to compare different investment opportunities purely in terms of price per square meter or some of the more conventional ways that you would have looked at them. But I think when you're making that decision about where to place your investment, you've got to think about what's going to drive the longevity of my returns. And I think that dependability point is about making sure that the property that you're buying into has an association with it that will be carried forward into the future. That will ensure that people will want to live there, people will pay a premium to live there, because that's what's going to underpin the investment returns. And I think interestingly what that then also brings us back to is people talk a little bit about sort of residual value, which is quite a sort of intangible concept. But if you think about why people buy certain makes of car, there's a perception that if you buy something that has the attributes of the maker's brand attached to it, then in particular when you're spending a lot of money on something that you're not going to keep for the whole of your life, then that will have a residual value that's higher than another make or model that maybe doesn't have those attributes attached to it. So I think there is an element with branded accommodation from an investor's perspective of being able to think about what will make the resale value of this stronger if I want to move the investment on. And that links back, of course, to all of those things that we said, which are why a resident will want to live in that building in the first place. So we're starting to see the ways here that what drives the resident market in terms of why brands matter and the currency that brands deal in with what is linked to an investor's motivation for choosing where to invest.
Absolutely. And I think for the investor, investing in kind of branded residential property with credible developers, they also have an understanding of what service they can expect as well, don't they? So that sort of end-to-end service that credible developers should offer, I think that's a huge kind of peace of mind factor for them as well, isn't it? The service aspect.
Yeah, and again, this is something we talk about a lot, and I think the reason that we promote investment in buildings that we have designed ourselves for the purpose of selling and then subsequently managing is because we have a control over the product that you don't have if those three things haven't been conceived and put together in that way.
Okay, so post-pandemic then, it's been so widely reported that we've really seen a shift in buyer and renter behaviour. You know, ever since we were forced to kind of live in our homes for such a long period of time, those homes became our offices, our gyms, our social spaces. And I think there is definitely a kind of widely reported long-term result of that people do have shifted priorities, people do have more expectations of their homes. And I think while many developers and investors have absolutely kind of cottoned onto that fact and are, you know, investing in developments with all sorts of amenity space, gyms, swimming pools, you know, that co-working space, what can investors and indeed developers do now to stand out in that quite saturated market?
Yeah, so you're right. I think everybody's realised that we all spend a lot more time at home than we realised. And I think in a city centre context, what's happened is the boundaries between our home life, our working life, our social life have all started to blur a little bit. So, you know, we're seeing buildings now designed to sort of weave those kinds of spaces together. And that's led to a change in design philosophy for sure. So, you know, the reason that we and others now design a lot of working lounge space and meeting space, socializing space, and fitness and wellness space into buildings is to play into that need. So that has definitely happened. I think that also has promoted that change in behaviour and thought from residents and renters in terms of, you know, I'm spending a lot of time in this place. It's a huge part of my disposable income. So they're being much more careful about the choices that they make.
Yeah.
You know, we know that location is really important, but also they are willing to pay for spaces and environments that absolutely give them the maximum in terms of how you weave all of those different elements of their life together. And again, I refer back to my previous point about student accommodation. I think one of the reasons, you know, we sold a lot of purpose-built student accommodation at Select Property. And I think what student accommodation has sort of transfused now into the general residential market is this understanding that, you know, students actually spend a relatively small amount of time at university. They spend most of their time at home, studying alone and with others, socializing, meeting people, gaming, you know, doing all kinds of stuff that all takes place within the building that we call their accommodation. And, you know, you might think, well, the accommodation is the place that you sleep for 8 hours of the 24 in a day. And, you know, you might spend a couple of other hours there as well. But actually, they spend a lot of time there. And as a provider and operator, you have to understand that and make sure that you're providing amenity and service that meets all of those needs. And when you do that well, then you can charge a premium for it and you can create that pent-up demand for your product. So I don't think that change in people's working patterns and lifestyles brought about in the last 3 years in particular has radically changed that. I think it's probably brought it to light a lot more, and it's probably accelerated it in a way that's been very noticeable.
Absolutely. And I think while so many developers are now sort of creating all of these amenity spaces and outdoor spaces, etc., and really playing into that need of the resident, how do they bring these spaces to life? Because we've seen lots of different examples in the market where they have these incredible amenities, but somehow are quite soulless and often quite empty, and these spaces aren't being used. How do we really bring these spaces to life and give them meaning and value to ensure that the residents are using them?
It's a really interesting question, isn't it? And I think what you're getting at is that it doesn't happen by itself. I think the thing about a lot of people talk about communities within buildings and communities around buildings. But I think it takes actually quite a lot of hard work to make that happen authentically. And I think you can tell. I think when you go in a building where there is a community of residents that feels very naturally brought together and that it's happening for real, then that's palpable. Like I was at Affinity Living Riverside this morning and Riverview next door. And when you walk through those buildings, you just sense that it's happening for real. Whereas some buildings that you go in, they might have all of the same amenity space and, they might look very similar, but somehow it's not really happening. So I think that's got partly to do with location. And obviously we always choose the locations where we think that community can be activated more easily. I think it's the stuff that we were talking about in terms of the brand, so what are the attributes of living what does it mean to live in an Affinity Living building that means that comes to life in that way? And then I think it's about graft. I think you've just got to work really hard at it. And, I think it takes a lot of effort and work. And I think the mistake perhaps that some developments and developers make is thinking that happens naturally, create the space and it will just magically appear. But I think it doesn't. I think you've got to work hard to make it happen. And I think it's got to be authentic because people will see through it if it's not authentic. And again, these things start to then become self-fulfilling. So coming back to that point about when people identify with living, I live at Affinity Living, not I live at 32 Key Street. I think what they're saying is I am part of this community that means something to me and means something to other people now because there's an association with it and a recognition that happens in that space. I think that's very powerful when you can get it right. And again, one of the reasons that we only sell buildings for Affinity Living, certainly that we have designed to be managed in that way, is because we secure the way that we're able to do that in lots of very minute details that at face value might seem very simple, but actually have taken lots and lots of thought processes to bring together. And it certainly doesn't happen by itself, and you can't fake it, I think. And I think I was really interested by the comment you told me about how investment or certain cities are that show the best investment credentials are the ones that are able to capture a sense of what it's like to be in a village.
Yeah, JLL reported cities with a village feel is where we're seeing the most demand. So, Manchester, Birmingham, that have these kind of pockets like the Northern Quarter, Spinningfields. And I think, again, that's something that's been accelerated post-pandemic as well. I think people felt the need for connectivity. And, of course, that's what a city's all about, isn't it? That kind of, we saw that pent-up demand for city living and people being together. And as you touched on, those kind of thriving communities. And I think in these build-to-rent developments, it's about kind of placemaking, isn't it? And choosing the right eatery and the right eatery brand that's going to really go hand in hand and be reflective and representative of the community surrounding as well. Not just for the residents that live in the building, but really kind of integrating them into the city.
I think that's right. It's really interesting how that happens, isn't it? And it doesn't surprise me, but it really stood out as a statistic. And again, I think what that says is something about the authenticity of how that community comes together. But also that there is there's a scale at which it works, which isn't sort of infinitely something that you can grow or exceed its natural scale. So I think cities that do have identifiable neighbourhoods and a cultural imprint in those neighbourhoods that you can draw from in terms of how you design your building, but also how you sort of capture what's already there in that neighbourhood as part of what you're doing. Again, it comes back to how you design your operating model to fit into what's already there. So I think it's really important that you do that. And we see in the neighbourhoods around our building, and by working with independent operators that we bring into our buildings to activate some of those spaces. That community works at a scale where it does feel personal and real and authentic, and that works better in certain contexts than it does in others. So I think we Manchester is a gift of a city to work with there, because we feel the strength of that community very strongly, don't we, when you walk around the different parts of town. And interestingly, like when you walk around parts of London, you feel it as well. But also it's such a big city, and it's such an international city, and the population feels much more transient, that I think it's harder to recreate that village feel, maybe in certain very sort of micro locations. I mean, these things take a lot of time and effort to really understand and tap into that, don't they?
Yeah, absolutely.
But they are very much designed into the fabric of the building. And again, it comes back to the question about, what are you actually buying as an investor? And I don't think that you're buying the lump of concrete and the glass that's fixed to it. I think you're buying something that is within the fabric of the building, but it's to do with how it's been designed to fit in with that local context, to activate that authentic community within it, to create that brand that feels real to people, that they can associate and identify with, that they can choose to spend their money on in a way that will drive the demand and the rent for the long term.
Absolutely. I think historically, some investors might sort of be a lot more focused on that return and not sort of care as much, or not find out or research as much about the communities and the brands and the lifestyle that these developments are offering. But actually the two go hand in hand, don't they? These communities that we're activating are what's driving the strongest and most consistent returns. I know there's that stat as well about if somebody knows somebody else in the building, I think they're over 70% more likely to stay and to renew their contract. And that figure then goes up if they know more than one person. So I think it's now really on the radar of investors to invest in a community and in a lifestyle that is taken on a life of its own after the development completes.
And I think that's why we spend so much time and take responsibility for trying to educate our investors on exactly those sorts of things, so that they understand and get that. And when we're able to bring them into buildings so that we can show them it in real life, then they get it. I've been at those events, and you almost see the penny drop. It's like, oh, I get it now.
Yeah.
And however much you're able to try and convince people on paper, I think it's only when you see it happen for real. And like I said, I was in one of those buildings this morning, and I just had a very strong sense of it in my sort of peripheral vision that this was a community of people that sort of know each other and are comfortable with each other. They like the space. The space of their home is flowing out of their apartment into the rest of the building in a way that feels very natural. And that only happens because we've designed it that way and we've promoted it that way. And that's when you start to leverage the power and the status of that brand.
And I think that also feeds into why it's so valuable investing in a brand, because of course with us selling off-plan property, as most build-to-rent developers do, I think it can be really difficult to kind of bring that vision to life for yourself when you've just got the sort of floor plans and the CGIs and it looks great and shiny. But until you go into a completed branded residential development, that's when, like you say, you can really sort of feel it come to life and understand what it is that you're investing in. But I want to move on to talk about a big buzzword at the moment, and that's sustainability. So it means something different to everyone, really. But to you, what does a sustainable investment look like?
Well, I think you're right. I think it means lots of different things. And if we put aside some of the more obvious associations with sustainability, which are that, of course, your buildings need to be high performing, they need to be energy efficient, they need to have all of the highest standards in terms of thermal values that retain heat, that mean that you keep your energy consumption down. They need to be designed to be able to manage and process waste efficiently, so that we're reducing the use of natural resources and the harm on the environment when you build in city centres, which are, of course, always constrained in that way. So all of that is not taken for granted, but is essential, but is almost a given. And because we're designing new buildings, the regulations that come with that now almost force us down a path to ensure that that's the case. For me, sustainability means more than that. Sustainability is the way that you signal that you're going to be dependable for the long haul. And I think of sustainability from an investor's point of view almost as another word for resilience and longevity. And it comes back to that brand point. If you're investing in something where you've got a 5, 10, 15-year time horizon, you want to know that your investment is going to be protected for at least the whole of that period, and also that building is going to be have a residual value well beyond that period, so that when you're looking to exit that investment, then it has an appeal that will attract a good value for the person that's going to buy it from you. So I think of sustainability in terms of long-term decision making, and yes, that's partly about how buildings are designed. You certainly don't want buildings to be designed where they're going to have to be constantly redesigned or refitted. These things are expensive and they erode investment returns. But for me, the way that you ensure sustainability is about really understanding the needs of the people that are going to live in them and designing the buildings in the first place around those needs. And again, I think it has less to do with the raw materials. It's not so much about it's very much about location, because location tends to prevail. We make decisions about where to build the buildings that we want to operate based on what we believe to be long-term sustainable demand. But I think it's more about designing buildings that have an understanding of and flexibility to evolve with those changing demands of the people that are going to live there. And in that sense, I think, again, people need to think about what they're actually spending their money on. Are they spending their money on the raw materials of which the building is made, or are they spending their money on the expertise of the people that have designed them and that will operate them on their behalf, to have really understood and thought through in minute detail what's going to make these buildings still be high performing, in demand buildings in another 10 years' time? And if I was an investor, that would be one of the questions I would ask myself and ask of the person that I was thinking of buying a property from, is how are you going to secure that demand for the long term? And that, for me, I think is as much what sustainability is about as all the other things that we immediately think of when we talk about sustainability. But we mustn't forget as well that sustainability is an important topic for residents as well. I was
just going to say that, yeah, increasingly so as well.
I think that's right. And again, that's partly to do with the how people are starting to think of their accommodation provider as a branded operator now. Young consumers in particular want to spend their money on brands that they feel are aligned with their own values. They want to know that their buildings are being operated sustainably. They want to know that they've been designed with sustainability credentials for the long term built into them. So that's essential. And of course, they will reject brands that they feel are unsustainable or unethical in that way. So as a designer and developer of buildings, we have to make sure that we are doing all of the things that demonstrate that we are making those decisions for the long term. And that creates the appeal for the people that are going to live in them, but also it underpins the investment returns for the people that are going to buy them.
Absolutely. And I think especially millennials, they're a lot more environmentally conscious than previous generations. And this is only going to increase as the next generation continue to emerge in the rental space. But I think we've seen, especially recently, given the energy crisis and rising energy costs, we're actually seeing that residents are going for more expensive prime city centre stock because they tend to have better EPC ratings. And they're seeing that despite paying a higher premium for rent and all these amenities and a better lifestyle, their monthly outgoings are actually less because they provide better energy efficiency. So I think for the first time now, we're really seeing that kind of come into fruition.
Yeah, and that comes across actually in the feedback that you get from residents. I was reading one of the feedback surveys from Affinity Living buildings, and those comments stand out. People say, "Oh, my apartment's really cozy. I can't hear the street noise outside. I hardly ever have to put the heating on." So you can tell that they're thinking about these things.
Yeah.
And the other thing about that younger generation in particular as well is, like they want everything to be low friction. It has to be easy for them. They don't want complication. And, yes, you can change your energy provider, you can shop around and all this kind of stuff. But actually what they want is they want a lot of that work to have been done for them by the developer and operator of the building. And again, that's when, having a building that's operated by the people that have designed and developed it really comes into play, because you can develop a whole long range strategy for how you're going to do that. You're designing buildings that are going to be energy efficient from the off. You've got an operating strategy where, you're going to operate them sustainably. You're going to encourage behaviours that keep consumption low. You can sign up to procurement of energy in a way that secures certainty around pricing, in a way that you can package all of that up to the residents in a really easy to understand and easy to consume way that doesn't give them a load of the hassle that comes with having to sort that out for your own home if you're not in one of those branded residences. And I think that's going to be something that's going to be a really key feature of the evolution of branded living in city centres is how you leverage your expertise and your scale as a developer and operator to take some of that uncertainty and some of that hassle away from your residents, because they will really value that, because they will pay a premium to be in a building that absolutely synchronises with their lifestyle needs in that way. But they want it to be low friction. They want all the work done for them. So that's something that's challenging us a little bit at the moment. But we're finding ways that we can evolve how we do that to meet that expectation.
And I think that's also a massive benefit for the investor who might want that sort of hands-off, hassle-free investment, to have trust in that developer that they've sort of got all of that due diligence done and they're sort of carrying things out in the best way. But just to wrap up then, final question. It's been a great, hopefully really valuable conversation for so many investors. But for someone who's considering their next property investment, what are your top tips or the most important factors that you would say to consider?
Yeah, so picking out on the themes that we've talked about, I think if I was an investor, I would be asking, has this development been designed with an operating philosophy or strategy in mind? Show me how the brand that is attached to this building is going to activate the community of people that are in it, is going to create that long-term demand that is going to underpin my returns. What is it about this building that will make people pay a premium to live in there and want to stay for the long term? And again, it's all those things that signal long-term decision making and dependability. And I would say, look, show me a building that you built 10 years ago and show me how the decisions that you made then have translated now to long-term high demand, high occupancy. Walk around those buildings if you have an opportunity to do that, so that you can see that it's for real. You can see all the hard work that's gone into that. And when you sense that there is genuinely a brand philosophy at the heart of the operation of the building, then you can start to understand how that sustainability is something that is going to underpin long-term returns, so that when you're still getting that income in another 10 years' time, you know that the kind of people that are living in the building then, the building has evolved to provide for all of the things that are going to ensure that they want to stay there as well.
That was amazing. Perfect. Thank you so much, Giles, for joining me. It's been great to chat with you as always.
No problem.
And to everybody watching, thank you so much for tuning in. You can subscribe on your platform of choice. We're on YouTube, Spotify, Google Podcasts, and Apple Podcasts.